Peter, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar to discuss China's Global Security Initiative, or GSI, as put forward by President Xi Jinping and organized, as you've heard, by the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, SACU. My name's Keith Bennett, and I'll be chairing our event this evening. I'm a long-standing SACU member, and in fact, I worked full-time for the organization between 1979 to 1981. This evening, we have an excellent lineup of speakers representing a range, or indeed a plurality, I should have chosen a different word there, I think, a plurality of views. I will introduce each of them in turn before they speak. The meeting is scheduled to last for about an hour and a half. We have 5 speakers who I'm hoping will each speak for about 10 minutes as requested. And this should leave a reasonable amount of time for our Q&A. The procedure for the Q&A is that you should type any question in the Q&A box that you should be able to find at the foot of your screen, and you can choose to address them to a particular member of the panel, to the panel as a whole, or just simply submit them, and you're welcome to submit them at any time. I'm looking forward to hearing our speakers, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But what I'd like to very briefly say is that the concept paper on the GSI released by China on February the 21st this year covers a wide range of issues and is, in my view, well worth reading. Some initial responses to this and similar initiatives from China have claimed that they merely rehearse or repeat general principles rather than being concrete and leading to actions. I would submit that such criticism is inaccurate and unfair. Rather, what we have seen, especially in the months since the release of the concept paper, as well as, for example, position papers on Ukraine and Afghanistan, is a frenetic pace of diplomatic activity. The great surprise, of course, was the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered and announced in Beijing. This in turn set off a ripple of reconciliation in the Middle East, with the return of Syria to the Arab League, advancing the prospects for peace and reconciliation in that country, and with peace talks and exchanges of prisoners, hopes for an end to the dreadful war and humanitarian disaster in Yemen, a war no less awful, but continuing for longer and inflicted on a more impoverished population than the conflict in Ukraine. In the case of Ukraine, we've seen President Xi's telephone call with President Zelensky, followed by the first round of talks by China's special envoy in the capitals of Ukraine, Russia, Poland, as well as in Western Europe. Clearly, this tragic conflict can't be solved in a day, but even many Western commentators have had to concede that China is the only major power in a position to intercede and engage with all parties, whether in Ukraine or the Middle East. Our first speaker, who we're really delighted is able to join us, is Minister Wang Qi from the Embassy of China in the UK. Minister Wang joined China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1995, where he worked in the Department of North American and Oceanian Affairs, and over the next 18 years served alternately and twice at the department and in the Chinese Embassy in the United States. From 2013 to 2019, he worked at the Office of the Foreign Affairs Leading Group of the CPC's Central Committee, and in 2019, he was assigned to the Chinese Embassy in the UK. Welcome, Minister Wang, and we look forward to your remarks now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Keith Bennett. Distinguished guests, dear friends, it's a real delight to join you at the SACU panel discussion on the Global Security Initiative concept paper. On behalf of the Chinese Embassy in the UK, I would like to pay tribute, express our thanks to all the guests present today for your care and the support for China-UK friendship and cooperation. Today, our world, our times, and history are changing in ways like never before. And the international community is confronted with multiple risks and challenges rarely seen before. With the future of all humanity in mind and exploring ways to address the root cause of security challenges facing humanity, President Xi Jinping proposed the Global Security Initiative in April 2022. The initiative gives clear answers to questions of our times, such as what security concept the world needs and how countries can achieve common security. It contributes China's wisdom and solution to the efforts of mankind in addressing international security challenges. This February, China published the Global Security Initiative concept paper, which expounds the core ideas and principles of the GSI, identifies the priorities, platforms, and mechanisms of cooperation, and demonstrates China's sense of responsibility for safeguarding world peace and firm resolve to defend global security. Recently, Ambassador Zheng Zheguang wrote to Ms. Zhou Reid and elaborated in detail the main content and importance of the concept paper. The concept paper lays out 20 priorities of cooperation, all highly action-oriented, and they could be summarized as follows. Upholding the UN's central role in security governance. The authority of the UN should be safeguarded. The UN should be supported in its efforts to prevent war and conflict, develop and peace building, architecture, and promote post-war reconstruction, and in playing bigger role in global security affairs. And promoting coordination and sound interactions among major countries. Major countries should take the lead in upholding equality, cooperation, and rule of law. Hegemonic, ruling, and domineering practice should be rejected. And joint efforts should be made to build a framework of major country relations featuring peaceful coexistence, overall stability, and balanced development. And facilitating peaceful settlement of hostile issues through dialogue. Support should be extended to the parties involved to settle their disputes and difference through dialogue and consultation. The international community should speak up for justice, cool down hotspots, and deflate tensions. Tackling traditional and non-traditional security challenges. It is important to promote global strategic stability, oppose arms race, and diffuse nuclear war risks. Combined efforts are needed to find COVID-19, combat terrorism, and safeguard the data security, biosecurity, and stability of supply and scientific and technology chains, and strengthening the system and capacity of global security governance. A security governance architecture featuring coordination among governments and international organizations and participation of non-governmental organizations should be developed. China will hold a high-level event on GSI at the proper time to discuss with all parties ways to promote security. In implementing the GSI, China advocates the following 5 principles. First, mutual respect. The purpose and principles of UN Charter should be observed. The equality among countries regardless of size, strength, and wares should be upheld. Different systems, religions, and civilizations should be treated as equals. The core interests of all countries and the legitimate security concerns of all parties should be respected. Second, openness and inclusion. The GSI targets no particular country and excludes no particular party. All countries are welcome to join the GSI if they so wish. All efforts for global peace and development will be supported. Third, multilateralism. Bilateral and multilateral security cooperation should be pursued among countries around the world, and international and regional organizations in line with the principle of extensive connotation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. Issues that matter to all should be addressed by all. Greater synergy should be forged among various security visions to seek the greatest possible common ground. Fourth, mutual benefit and win-win. The principle of indivisible security should be followed. One's own security and the common security of all should be advanced side by side. By pursuing win-win cooperation that contributes to each other's progress, and opposing zero-sum game that benefits oneself at the cost of others, to expand the converging interest among all. Fifth, the holistic approach, a holistic approach. Security governance needs to be advanced in a coordinated manner, and traditional and non-traditional security threats should be tackled in a holistic way. Each equal emphasis should be placed on security and development to eliminate the breeding ground of insecurity and seek fundamental and durable ways for achieving sustainable security. As a country that first proposed GSI, China has taken rare actions to implement it. It has been more than 1 year since the full escalation of the Ukraine crisis. The world has been following the development of crisis. China is deeply worried about the escalation of the conflict, or worse, even a spiral out of control. Since the Ukraine crisis broke out, China has all along stood on the side of peace and taken an objective and impartial stance based on the merits of the issue. President Xi Jinping has put forward 4 principles, called for joint efforts in 4 areas, and shared 3 observations on Ukraine, which has played a responsible and constructive role in easing the situation and de-escalating the crisis. President Xi pointed out that all countries deserve respect for their sovereignty and territorial integrity. The purpose and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of any party should be taken seriously, and support should be given to all efforts that are conducive to peacefully resolving the crisis. China will continue to promote peace talks, contribute its ideas for political settlement of crisis, and join the international community in promoting dialogue and consultation, addressing the concerns of all parties and seeking common security. On the Iranian nuclear issue, China has actively promoted the resumption of a joint comprehensive plan of action to uphold the legitimate rights and interests of relevant countries and the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. On the Korean Peninsula issue, China stands for pursuing in parallel the establishment of peace mechanism and the denuclearization of peninsula, and addressing legitimate concerns of all parties in a balanced manner to safeguard peace and stability on the peninsula. On the Middle East, China welcomes and supports security dialogues among regional countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as regional efforts to build a Middle East security architecture that suits the realities of the region and accommodates the interests of all parties. China is also firmly committed to a defensive nuclear strategy. We have honored our pledge to no first use of nuclear weapons and always kept our nuclear capabilities at minimum level required by national security. China is the only one among the 5 nuclear weapon states to have made this pledge. China's position is above board and should not be distorted. Ladies and gentlemen, human history has proven time and again that without peace, development will be like water without source. And without security, prosperity will be like trees without roots. China stands ready to work with all countries and peoples who love peace and pursue development to put the global security initiative into action, inject more impetus into the effort to build a community of shared security for mankind, and bring greater peace, security, and prosperity to the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Minister Wang, for that very masterful presentation and summary of so many of the key points in the concept paper. And I was particularly struck. Well, I was struck by many things that you said, but I was particularly struck by your early emphasis on the central role of the United Nations, and I just I wanted to just underline, just bring out one line from the concept paper on that, which I think is a very important point made, where it says that the various confrontations and injustices in the world today did not occur because the purposes and principles of the UN Charter are outdated, but because they are not effectively maintained and implemented. I think that's a very important point to dwell on. And of course, your reiteration of China's consistent policy going back right to 1964, I think, of no first use of nuclear weapons, also very important. And the concept paper mentions the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, which was something reiterated again by the five recognized nuclear powers, but which sometimes seems to have been forgotten in the heat of some of the events in the world today. Which brings me very nicely on to our next speaker, and it's my pleasure to welcome Tom Unterrainer. Tom is the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. CND was formed in 1957, which makes it even older than me, and it is one of the world's most famous and respected organizations campaigning for peace and disarmament. Tom is also the co-editor of The Spokesman, which is the journal of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, and the most recent issue of that journal is entitled Eurasia in the World and considers China's global security initiative as well as the changing nature of global power. So Tom, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and special thanks to SACU, Peter for hosting us this evening, Keith for chairing, Minister Wang for his introduction, and to others for making sure that this event took place. Now look, I think it's very important that China has raised the question once again and raised the ideas and principles around indivisible or common security. And just to restate those very as clearly as I possibly can, it's the idea that you cannot possibly create conditions of real security at the expense of others, and that there's a warning that goes along with this basic principle, and it's if you attempt to do so, if you convince yourself that you can create conditions of security for your own state at the expense of others, you simply create further instability and further risk. Now, I obviously want to focus on nuclear weapons questions as they relate to the global security initiative. But in doing so, it would be wrong to conceive of nuclear risks as entirely separate from general security issues that the GSI seeks to address. And I'd go further and say that eliminating the existential risks posed by the prospect of nuclear use is a central aspect of any coherent approach to security. Now, priority 3 of the GSI concept paper addresses the nuclear questions directly, and opens, as Keith mentioned, with a reaffirmation of the 2022 joint statement of 5 nuclear-armed states, China included. This statement was, of course, a reaffirmation of a similar statement by Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s. It states, a nuclear war cannot be won, and therefore it must never be fought. But since this January 22 statement, this reiteration by the P5, rather than a reduction in nuclear risks, the world is faced with the most acute set of nuclear risks since the opening of the atomic age. And as evidence for this, we need look no further than the decision of the atomic scientists to set their doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight. This cautionary metaphor, signalling the perils we all face resulting from the combined dangers posed by the risk of nuclear war, climate catastrophe, and technological threats has never been as close to midnight as it is now. And the atomic scientists were clear about the contribution of nuclear threats arising from the terrible events in Ukraine to their decision. So it goes without saying that the proposals contained in China's GSI, if they were to become the norm through which states and groups of states interacted on the global stage, then we would expect to see a drastic winding back of the minute and second hands on the atomic scientists' doomsday clock. But of course, looking historically, the proposals such as those contained in the GSI are not a new departure for China. And if you trace the public statements of leading spokespeople from the time of China's emergence as an atomic and nuclear power in the 1960s through to the 1980s, when the concept of common security was promoted by progressive forces in Europe and elsewhere, through to the wording of the GSI, there is a certain continuity of thought and concern that is overt. For example, China's test of an atomic bomb on the 16th of October 1964 was not accompanied by jubilant, boastful, or threatening public statements. Rather, official statements and the communique issued by Premier Zhou Enlai struck a note of regret. China's initial statement reported, and I quote, "The Chinese government has consistently advocated the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of nuclear weapons. If this had been achieved, China need not have developed nuclear weapons, but our proposals were met with stubborn resistance." The statement further made clear that, and I quote again, "The Chinese government hereby solemnly declares that China will never at any time or under any circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons," a statement of the no first use policy that's already been mentioned, which remains central to China's nuclear posture to this day. Worthy of note is the fact that the US and UK, for instance, repudiate a no first use commitment. China's statement also proposed, and I quote again, that a summit conference of all countries of the world, be convened to discuss the question of the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of nuclear weapons. And that as a first step, the summit conference should reach agreement to the effect that the nuclear powers and those countries which may soon become nuclear powers undertake not to use nuclear weapons, neither to use them against non-nuclear countries and nuclear-free zones, nor against each other. This is 1964. Zhou Enlai's communique to world leaders sent the following day, on the 17th of October 1964, reiterated this proposal that, to quote, China's mastering of nuclear weapons is entirely for defense and for protecting the Chinese people from nuclear threat. Now, it could be argued that Zhou Enlai's attempt to rationalize China's attainment of nuclear weapons capability is similar to rationalizations employed by every state that has achieved nuclear weapons capabilities. Now, whereas this argument is not completely false, in my view, but China's continued arguments for nuclear abolition and multiple proposed mechanisms to achieve this, both before 1964 and after, are a matter of record. And it's also a matter of record that China has been repeatedly threatened with nuclear attack, first by Truman in 1950, then by Eisenhower in 1953, and then again and again throughout the 1950s. The UK National Archives show that the British government even considered issuing a threat of nuclear attack against China in 1963. As the record also shows, these nuclear threats came not only from the West, but also from the Soviet Union during the nadir of relations with China. And it's probably true to say that of all the threats issued by nuclear-armed states, more have been issued against China than against any other nation. Now, China has made repeated efforts to advance proposals and potential roads towards nuclear disarmament. From 1964 and before, through to the 1982 UN Special Session on Disarmament, right up until today. In the intervening 6 decades, China's internal development has been staggering, and the dynamics of global relations and global power have shifted to a similarly staggering extent. all of which makes the consistency in approach to nuclear risks worthy of note. But as interesting and instructive as the historical record is, we live in the here and now, where nuclear risks are abundant. Priority 3 of the GSI concept paper, together with the general framework proposed in the document, offers a number of straightforward measures that could drastically reduce these risks. The GSI calls for strengthened dialogue and cooperation between nuclear weapon states to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Today, in place of such dialogue and cooperation, we have the trading of nuclear threats and an apparent breakdown of dialogue. Ending these threats and commencing proper discussion is vital. The GSI further calls for safeguarding of the international nuclear non-proliferation regime based on the NPT. Now, all the main nuclear powers are signed up to the NPT, and all of them have work to do to ensure compliance with it. But the fact of the matter is, over the past decade or more, possibly 2 decades, the international structure which has been put in place to regulate, control, and to guard against proliferation has been systematically undermined. And much of that undermining originated from the offices of the President of the United States in Washington. Things need to change in that respect. And importantly, the GSI proposes active support for the efforts of countries in relevant regions to establish nuclear weapon-free zones. Such active support would not only mirror mechanisms included in previous approaches to common security, but would activate proper consideration of those countries which have ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, 68 of them so far, from Antigua and Barbuda to Vietnam, each of which have established nuclear weapon-free zones on their territory. So as we're repeatedly told, a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. China's call for a system of international cooperation on nuclear security and a fair, collaborative and mutually beneficial international security system would be an important step forward. The only question that remains is, how soon can progress be made on this call? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom, for that really, I think, excellent contribution, setting out both current issues and the a detailed historical background, and particularly laying stress on the point that China has consistently made of its stand for the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of all nuclear weapons. Before I introduce the next speaker, I'd just like to make a quick reminder to everyone that the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen, and everyone is welcome to put in any questions that they may have to any or all of the speakers at any time. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Zeno Leoni. He's a lecturer in Defence Studies at the Defence Studies Department of King's College London, based within the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. And he is also an affiliate to the Lao China Institute of King's College London. His most recent book is entitled Grand Strategy and the Rise of China, Made in America, and it appeared in April. And he is currently working on his 3rd book, which is on the new Cold War. In introducing Zeno, I'd just like to say that the Lao China Institute and especially its director, Professor Kerry Brown, have been great friends of SACU, and we're very pleased that Zeno can join us in tonight's event. So, Zeno, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I'm talking at the SACU event. I know you've been used to having Kerry Brown, who you just mentioned, perhaps in the past, but I'll try to offer some good points, nonetheless. I'm not a sinologist. I work with China, but more from an international relations perspective. So maybe this is the reason why sometimes I find difficult to interpret some of the statements of the documents or of the phrases that I used. As you mentioned, you alluded to this in the introduction. Perhaps some people argue that maybe the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, doesn't mean much, doesn't contain much, and you challenge that. I guess we always need to somehow try to read between the lines. Perhaps that's certainly what I do normally, and that's what I wanted to do today with you. Because, as I said, China launches many frameworks, and sometimes these frameworks come after, relevant policies were already in use. Sometimes framework or phrases are still around when certain relevant policies are not in use anymore, perhaps. And sometimes the language is abstract, so one can struggle with it. Perhaps, I guess, one of the reasons why we have all these, emerging frameworks coming from China, well, certainly is because China is becoming, has been, over the last decades for sure, has become central to international relations, but also because it is becoming a great power, and so it also needs a narrative. But anyway, I think so. Regardless of all these challenges for somebody who is not, strictly speaking, a sinologist, reading the Global Security Initiative concept paper, I wanted to highlight 3 points, 3 aspects that got my attention, and I think somehow some of them have been mentioned already. I think the first point that really got my attention was the concept of common security. I won't make any judgment. I won't say whether it's positive or negative, but the analysis that I infer from this is that if there is a great power, a big country like China, that demands or that wants to launch a concept of common security, it means that out there is not a shared or agreed concept of common security yet. And my mind went straight to Kissinger's book on the world order, where rightly, I agree with him, he challenged this idea of, which is a very Western idea of international community. An international community, in my view, as in Kissinger's view, doesn't exist. If it exists, is a very narrow concept, which I think nowadays we can find it in the global West. There is this expression in use, certainly after the war in Ukraine. So just to be clear, the concept of the idea of a common security that China is looking for certainly is a challenge to the West. It also reflects a world where perhaps we have 2 competing truths. And also, interestingly, the emphasis on the United Nations Charter, this was mentioned. What I make of it is that, well, something I read recently, it exists a thing like sovereign internationalism, and then it exists democratic internationalism. Certainly, democratic internationalism is a phrase that reflects more US grand strategy, and the US perspective on global politics, while I think China is looking at the UN, is emphasizing the role of the UN because its elites believe more in what somebody calls sovereign internationalism. And so this was the first point, okay? The concept of deconstructing, making sense of the concept of common security. Something else I think it is worth deconstructing a bit, just very briefly, is this idea that China expects that the security and concerns of every country is taken seriously. I think this shows some disappointment and concerns about what I think is a new or an updated sphere of influence of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. I think it also reminded me of something that really has been a constant in Chinese foreign policy and in the relationship with the United States, which goes back 50 years since the first communique, since the meeting between Mao and Nixon. And so this idea that, which is also related to sovereign internationalism, that China expects respect for its domestic political system as it interacts with other countries. And to be fair, whether this is right or wrong, I think this respect for China's political system on part of the US, at least until recently, has been an important element that kept the relationship going for 50 years. And this is what I call the marriage of convenience. I'll get to it very shortly, very briefly. So the third point is that got my attention from the document is the Global South, how central that is. So the document mentions Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. It makes sense to me because I've come to the conclusion that this marriage of convenience between China and the West, China and the US is facing challenges. And I think China, although China really wants to, like the US, China wants to keep the relationship with the United States going, okay, doesn't want to break the relationship in the same way that the US doesn't, although there are obviously competing, especially domestically, there are competing views about that. But overall, both countries are trying to keep the relationship workable. Nonetheless, China is aware that the United States will not be a friend of China, and that in the near future, perhaps Europe will not be a partner from a geopolitical point of view, will not be a partner of China. And so where is China going to find partners? Certainly in the Global South, where for different reasons, they can better understand each other. And so in the short term, this is where Chinese grand strategy will aim at establishing stronger relationship with that part of the world. And this leads me to my final point, which is not anymore from the document. It's about context. I think we always need to explain context. Otherwise, perhaps we struggle to analyze events. Context is very important. I think Chinese grand strategy has two elements. We find both of them were born, if you want, since the first Opium War. The first element is not fully trusting the West, but China has to coexist with the West in this international order. The second element is modernization. Since the defeat in the first Opium War, China has wanted to modernize. And that's how the marriage of convenience somehow began between China and the West, and above all between China and the US. However, the war in Ukraine is a watershed, is a catalyst of many things, and is creating some frictions between China mistrust of the West and China's needs to modernize. And this friction, we see new fault lines, we see I call it a sort of a new kind of Iron Curtain, but because it's not just the war in Ukraine, is different US-led frameworks being launched in the Indo-Pacific, like AUKUS. And so countries are somehow very slowly taking positions in the international system. And certainly China needs friends at this time in history, in the same way that the United States has needed friends for its grand strategy to become a global grand strategy. The United States without Japan, Australia, and Italy, and Bahrain, perhaps, it would probably be a regional, if not local power in the Western Hemisphere. In the same way, China, if it wants to be a great power, if it wants to be influential in global affairs, it needs friends. And so it's trying to establish these relationships. And I think that's where the context in which we should see the global security partnership. Is an instrument, a framework, a narrative to build those relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I, for one, found that extremely interesting, some very thought-provoking observations and questions, which perhaps some of them we might return to in the discussion period. Our next speaker really needs no introduction, in my view, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. John Gittings is a pioneer of China studies in the UK, teaching Chinese at what is today the University of Westminster, previously the Polytechnic of Central London from the 1960s. His many books and countless articles on China also date from that time onwards. Following his teaching career, John worked at the Guardian newspaper for 20 years as assistant foreign editor, I should say. Now, I would have wished you'd been the assistant foreign minister of Britain, John, but alas, that's yet to happen. Assistant foreign editor and as chief foreign leader writer. And personally, not only do I wish that you'd been assistant foreign minister, I wish there was still someone with John's rare combination of knowledge and compassion working on the foreign desk of a major British daily. Together with his late wife, John established the Guardian's first staff office on the Chinese mainland in Shanghai in between 2001 and 2003. And since leaving the Guardian, he's worked mainly on the history of peace thought, most especially his book, The Glorious Art of Peace. He's also a research associate of the China Institute at SOAS University of London, and associate editor of the Oxford International Encyclopedia of Peace. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. I don't want to repeat what has already been said. Some very good contributions already. I'll try not to. Now, Keith, if I could just slightly take issue with you. You said it was unfair to describe the concept paper and GSI's statement of principles. I would suggest actually statements of principles are a very good thing as a starting point. And they give us something to bite on, you might say. As Zeno said, we should read between the lines, and that is what we have to do with Chinese statements, because as we all know, it's very hard to get sort of background information, off the record comment on very sensitive international issues from Chinese officials. So reading between the lines is what we do, and it's something what I've been doing for the last 40 or 50 years. So here we have a statement of principle. The second point I'd make about them is that it's not just, we shouldn't just interpret or try to interpret these principles in terms of what's happening at the moment, although it's obviously is important to see whether what is said in the GSI matches up to, let's say, what China is doing diplomatically as far as Ukraine war is concerned. But actually, this statement of principles should govern, and we should read into it something much broader and much more much longer lasting into the future, into the long-term future. I mean, presumably China's not going to change these principles in 1 or 2 or even 5 years. So they're going to be there for a long time. So we have to take a long view of what is in them. Given, as I've already said, slight difficulty of figuring out what is in them. Beyond the principles, which, you know, on the whole, we all agree with. I mean, very hard. I doubt whether anybody could find a single sentence in the concept paper with which one would disagree. You know, upholding world peace and security, promoting global development and prosperity, etc., 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 etc. We all think tremendous. But how do we translate these principles into practice? I've chosen 2 principles and 2 priorities to very briefly discuss. The first principle is to stay committed to abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. And again, I'm saying, thinking into the medium and long term, I'd like to ask a couple of questions there. What is China's attitude towards Security Council reform? And in particular, the exercise of the veto. You know, there are various schemes and discussions which have taken place at various times about whether, perhaps not abolishing the veto altogether, but weakening it. I think China it would be tremendous if China took the initiative and as a veto holding power, saying, we'd actually like to use the veto, we'd like to see it used less or not at all. And this is how we'd like to go about it, and to discuss and to promote a discussion on this with the other veto holding powers. That's the first question, which arises out of commitment to the UN Charter. Actually, there are three. The second is one would like to see much more support for the for the Secretary General. And I give, as an example, when the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres last year went on a peace mission to Kyiv and Moscow, he had zero support. Well, obviously he was not going to get much support from Russia, but he had zero support from the United States, from Britain, from France, and from China. And consequently, he came back saying, it's a failure. Where was that support? I would like to see China going out of its way to support the Secretary General in every way. Third, if it's impossible to reform the Security Council, is China in favor of giving greater authority to the General Assembly? And will China vocally support measures and initiatives which are taken by the great majority of General Assembly members? There are a number of issues where you do get a large majority in the General Assembly, and where the Security Council permanent five stand back with their hands behind their back, whereas they should be applauding, or there should be initiative, or they should be trying to drive it forward, or they should be using the General Assembly in order to seek a resolution to problems which cannot be solved in the Security Council. This is a large area where I'd like to hear more about how the Chinese view these issues, these very difficult problems. Right, on priorities, the concept paper expresses support for the United Nations paper, Our Common Agenda, which was adopted by the Security Council. What parts of that document, Our Common Agenda, does China support? What parts would it like to develop? I'd like to quote a couple of lines from Our Common Agenda, which I think are critical or should be critical. First, it says, now is the time to think for the long term, to deliver more for young people and succeeding generations, and to be better prepared for the challenges ahead. And the paper also calls for a summit of the future to forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like and what we can do today to secure it. Does China have any practical proposals to deliver on these two objectives? And the point about them, this is why they're so important, is they are dealing with the future, and they are dealing with the future of our younger and of future generations. And there is quite there's a very interesting discussion going on at the moment in various ways to try to establish the principle that policies at a national basis or international basis should be based on the principle of safeguarding future well-being, safeguarding the well-being of future generations. Here in England, there was a motion in the House of Lords put forward by John Bird, which got nowhere, but in Wales, they do in fact already have a commissioner who is supposed to vet any policy and say, how does this relate to the future well-being of our future generations? And of course, this is particularly important in relation to climate change. What does China have in mind that is China thinking in this long term, not only about its own domestic policies, but international policies which will safeguard the future and well-being of current and future generations. Okay, on nuclear, I mean, Tom has covered the nuclear issue very fully, and it was very good to hear Minister Wang reiterating China's position of no first use. It isn't always, I'm not sure whether it's actually mentioned in the extract which I have from the concept paper, which I think Tom also quoted from. I'm not sure whether no first use is in, certainly not in the paragraph I have here, although other things which you mentioned, non-proliferation, nuclear-free weapons-free zone are. So one would like to see China more actively perhaps discuss and promote the concept of no first use. Tom also mentioned the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, passed in 2017 by 122 nations and ratified so far by 68 nations, so is now come into force. As far as I can understand, China, again, this is one of those rare issues where all 5 permanent members of the Security Council speak with one voice. China was opposed to the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Why? I would like to, and I would like to see it China reconsider its opposition, particularly in the light of the fact that this is something, as I say, which has been passed by over a two-thirds majority of General Assembly members. And if you take the United Nations seriously, you take a decision and action taken by 2/3 of the General Assembly seriously too. I think the goal of universal nuclear disarmament is certainly much less stress is being placed on that now by China than in the past. The nuclear weapons reduction, force reduction, I think is being discussed rather less, and yet both are sort of inherent in the principles set out in this concept paper, and they follow from the consensus which the paper rightly asserts that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. If that is the case, more energetic measures should be taken in order to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, to reduce forces rather than increase them. I believe, although of course it's all classified information or secret information, but it is being suggested that China is actually increasing its nuclear weapon force, not decreasing it. One would certainly like China to address itself much more to this issue, because there's no good saying a nuclear war must not be fought if you continue to maintain the dangerous conditions under which a nuclear war may be fought. Here, as in many other areas, words have to be translated into action. So my conclusion is that the concept paper, GSI, should be the start of an open-ended discussion with China willing to discuss difficult issues such as charter reform and nuclear disarmament. And of course, it goes without saying that we should be urging our own governments to do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that very interesting presentation. You've raised an awful lot of questions, which, if I can use the word for the second time this evening, I think is very unfair, because you're the person who's supposed to give us the answers, not the questions. That's why you've spent your 50 years reading between the lines. But thank you very much indeed, John. I'd just like to comment on a couple of things. I think that China's commitment, although it's, I think, still in quite general terms, but China's commitment to UN Security Council reform is something that came up in President Lula of Brazil's recent state visit to China. And of course, on the use of the veto, China has been, for most of the time of its UN membership, very reluctant to use the veto, and has tended to use it very rarely. On the UN Secretary General Guterres, I note that of the 20-point proposal in the GSI concept paper, the very first point is to support the proposals put forth in our common agenda by the UN Secretary General. So that's one thing to note. But hopefully somebody or more than one person may respond to your some of your questions in the Q&A period. I think that could be very stimulating if we could continue those discussions. As you rightly said, this should be the start of an open-ended and candid discussion. Thanks again, John. Now, our final speaker also needs no introduction. Dr. Jenny Clegg is the Vice President of SACU, and she has followed China's development and foreign policy over many decades. I believe she first visited China as a member of a SACU delegation in 1970 or 1971. And prior to retiring, she was a senior lecturer in Asia Pacific and International Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. She is the author of several books, most notably, particularly for the purpose of tonight's discussion, of China's global strategy towards a multipolar world, along with countless articles, both academic and non-academic. Jenny is a key anti-war and peace activist and also a frequent panel speaker on China, as well as on the new Cold War and related topics. So Jenny, look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith, for that introduction. So I will give my take on the concept paper at the risk of repeating some of the points that have been made, but perhaps from a different angle. And there's no harm in reinforcing some of the central ideas that are being put before us. I don't think anyone has said that the GSI was first introduced last year as a forum for Asian dialogue. And I think that it's best understood as part of a series of initiatives which go along with the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, and also the Global Civilization Initiative. And as Xi Jinping has said, that China wants to bring Chinese wisdom to the world negotiating table. Now, thinking worldwide on security, this has broadened out over the years to cover not just matters of war and peace, but also issues of economic security, climate change, pandemics, human rights, and so on. At first sight, China's document appears as a quick skate over a broad list of concerns, citing also numbers of organizations and initiatives, mostly associated with China itself, making the document look decidedly Sinocentric. However, it needs a deeper dive to understand what is being presented here. The theme is cooperation, starting, as has already been pointed out, with principles. These are offered as a basis for recentering the UN and indeed increasing its role. The point that I want to highlight is how these principles are drawn from history and China's approach to problems, as Minister Wang said at the start, is to delve into the roots of issues. In fact, the first three elements of China's concept of common, comprehensive, coordinated and sustainable security are drawn from the concept of the conception of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which from 1975, against Cold War division and the spiraling nuclear arms race, sought to create a new security order for Europe, inclusive of the USSR. So it's from the OSCE that we get this concept of common and indivisible security, the idea that the security of one country should not come at the expense of another, which was originally put forward as an alternative to NATO's security idea based on bloc confrontation. It's also, as has also been mentioned before, the paper includes what's known as the Reagan-Gorbachev principle, which ended the nuclear arms race in 1985 with these words: "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." At the same time, China's conception integrates the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence: respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference, equality and mutual benefit, which have served as the basis of China's foreign policy over the decades. These principles were agreed first by Mao and Nehru in 1954, paving the way for the Bandung Conference in 1955, where African and Asian states, newly emerging from colonial rule and under pressure from the Cold War, sought to protect their independence and avoid war through collective non-alignment. The GSI then should not be simply seen as xenophobic, drawing as it does on these historical experiences, including the lessons of the 2 World War encompassed in the UN. Meanwhile, the 4th element of sustainable security covers China's long-standing views on the dialectic between peace and development. Peace is obviously essential for development, but development also contributes to resolving conflicts, eliminating, as the minister said, the breeding ground for insecurity. Now, moving on to the actors, the nation states, I think there is another dialectic that China sees here between major powers and regional formations. Clearly, good relations between major powers are a necessity for world peace, not least in reducing the risk of nuclear war. As well as setting an example of complying with the UN Charter, when conflicts occur, as the paper says, major powers need to support consultation on an equal footing and facilitate peace talks. The paper then enumerates regional contexts with their specificities. The Association of Southeast Asian States, with their distinctive approach to consensus building amongst politically diverse members. The Latin America Caribbean Zone of Peace, the need to strengthen the ability of African countries to safeguard peace independently, the need for Middle Eastern states to construct a new security framework, with the international community taking practical steps towards finding a 2-state solution to the Palestinian question, and the security of the Pacific Island states, which focuses on the threat from climate change. As has been noted, there's no mention here of the EU, US, or China, or Japan, which suggests China is looking to the global south for momentum, with security building also from the bottom up, region by region, bringing regional organization into the multipolar balance alongside the major powers. The point here, I think, is to grasp the dialectic between the international and the regional. So, for example, what major powers can do in terms of nuclear arms control could have a bearing on resolving the specific Russia-Ukraine dispute. Onto the contents of cooperation. The paper ranges widely from digital and information security to terrorism, from biosecurity to outer space. By finding complementary points of cooperation, countries can form closer partnerships as the building blocks of a peaceful and secure world order. The recent C-Macron agreement ran to some 50 points. Similarly, the C-Lula agreement. The ill-judged stance of the US and UK governments to confront, compete and cooperate only really concedes cooperation on climate change, ruling most of the rest of the list off limits, even weaponizing some concerns. So the paper then demonstrates China's method, or if you like, wisdom, in a number of ways. First of all, a holistic approach focusing on the dialectics of global security, seeking out the interconnections and key links of the process, the importance of summarizing the lessons from history, and the contextualizing of the universal in the particular, the international in the regional. So we've heard from Minister Wong about the need to eliminate the root causes of conflict. So, for example, the root cause of the Sudan fighting surely lies in desertification and land shortage. For China, NATO's expansion is the root cause of the Ukraine crisis. Whilst morality and justice are also seen as fundamental, China's pragmatic search to get to the bottom of a dispute seeks to break through rebarbative cycles of blame and accusation. For Ukraine, this may be the hardest thing. People understandably want retribution. Then there's also the matter of international law, which China sees as underpinning the UN system. From the Western perspective, the law is absolute, but for China, how the universal is applied varies from context to context according to local conditions. At the same time, Western lawmaking is designed to uphold private property and individual rights, while China also lends weight to public property and collective rights. How are such disputes and differences over the law to be resolved? Is China to be cast as the rule breaker? The Global Civilization Initiative, with its approach of mutual learning, might otherwise enable ways to be found of managing differences. The document does show China stepping up to the plate at a time of escalating war in Europe, accelerated militarization in the Pacific, when a top US general predicts a war with China within 2 years. Henry Kissinger gives it a little longer, 5 to 10 years, whilst other US officials put the chances of a war breaking out at 50% or more. There are no concrete solutions to be found in this document. China is just beginning to learn how to become a global power. It's early days. The point is first to understand what security is. For China, then, it's not simply a matter of treaties, procedures, and international laws requiring compliance, but a process, a long-term process to be managed. Just a last word from me. What seems to be missing from this essentially state-centric view is the role of international mass movements for peace and against war, which historically have played such an influential part. How are we to make people-to-people relations more effective in promoting the mission of international peace? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny, for that very interesting contribution, which I think was a really good way to round off the presentations from everybody. Zeno referred to the stress on the global south in the GSI concept paper. And I think Jenny also put that in a very good context, that this is not something new from China. It goes right back to the 5 principles initiated with Prime Minister Nehru in 1954, the Bandung Conference in 1955. So with all the changes and developments, both of the international situation in general and China's policies in particular, I think one can also see an essential continuum here. We've got, so far, we have 4 questions in the Q&A. They are available for all of the panelists to read, but for the benefit of everyone on the call, I propose to, well, actually, there's now 5. I'm going to start by reading the first 3 and have and ask for a round of comments, brief comments on those, and then move on to the next 2. If I read all of them at once, I think that people might get overwhelmed, and also people may wish to also respond. Other panelists may wish to respond to one or more of the points raised by John in his contribution. So the first one I'm going to read out says, "It was mentioned that context matters. I wanted to ask whether there is any indication as to whether China would have launched the GSI without the war in Ukraine, or did China launch it essentially to defend its stance on that war? The second one is, how does China's growing role and contribution as a solo mediator in international conflicts square with a multilateral initiative such as the GSI? And the third is, noting that the GSI is potentially a means for China to compete with the West, albeit peacefully, what action should the West take to improve geopolitical relations and thereby avoid further risk of escalation? Quite broad topics. I could say something about them, but I'll refrain from now and ask who would like to go first. I suggest whoever unmutes first and speaks goes ahead.
Well, I guess that may be me. Have I unmuted?
You are. Is that you, John?
It is John, yeah. And am I visible? Yeah. I have no idea whether the GSI is a result of China wishing to sort of improve its posture because of the Ukraine war, but that's a question which the Minister Wang can answer. As far as the second question is concerned, which I think suggests that China is, how does it square with how does China's unilateral diplomacy, for example, over Saudi Arabia and Iran square with the concept of multilateral diplomacy? I would suggest just to focus on the issue of Ukraine and to reinforce what I was saying about the need to take positive action in the United Nations, although it may be very difficult at the moment to see a peaceful resolution between the two, between Moscow and Kiev, because their positions are so far apart. China and other UN Security Council powers should be preparing the way, particularly for UN mediation and for a UN peacekeeping force and for UN backed security guarantees.
Okay. Let me say a few words.
Yes, sorry, I just forgot to unmute myself to say, please, welcome.
Okay. With respect to Ukraine crisis, I would like to add more information. Recently, China released a position document on the critical settlement of Ukraine crisis. China also appointed special representative on Ukraine on Eurasia affairs. From May 15 to 26, special representative of Chinese government on Eurasia affairs Li Hui visit Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and EU quarters and Russia to have extensive contact and exchanges with various parties on the critical settlement of Ukraine crisis. He made clear China's position and propositions, listened to the opinions and advice from various parties, and build up international common understandings. All parties attach high importance to Special Representative Li Hui's visit, fully recognize China's positive role in promoting talks for peace, command China's call for respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, and observing the purpose and the principles of UN Charter, and express hope that China will continue to exercise its constructive influence. So China will continue to act upon President Xi's call for joint efforts in 4 areas, 4 principles, and 3 observations. And we will continue to play our constructive role to promote peace talks and continue to build up common standings and mutual trust, encouraging the international community to find the broadest common understandings and make China's contributions to political settlement of Ukraine crisis. So China will continue play our constructive role to promote peace talks. With respect to China's role, I would say that China is strive for Chinese modernization. It's the modernization of 1.4 billion people. It's modernization of common prosperity is modernization of peaceful development. And China's development is, in particular, the modernization of the 1.4 billion Chinese people is a great boost to force of peace and stability in the world. And some people in the West countries characterize China as so-called challenge or even threat. This does not reflect reality. We have no interest to pursue so-called such or compete with others. We just want to improve livelihood of Chinese people and bring more and more opportunities for common development. One example is China's BII. BII was this year marks the 10 years anniversary of BII. During the past 10 years, BII has already become the most popular global international cooperation platform. To date, over 3/4 of countries around the world have joined the initiative, which also has generated 420,000 jobs in countries along the BRI. And so China will continue to bring more other benefits and opportunities to the world through our GSI, through our Global Development Initiative, through our Global Civilization Initiative. This is a very positive impetus to the global development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Wang. Is anybody else wish to comment on any of these issues before I introduce the next? There's now another 3 questions, so this is your chance if you want to say anything. Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks. So just to respond to some of the questions and some of the things that John said before, not everything, because there's quite a lot that's been raised. First of all, I'm sure that the Chinese government has been thinking about these things for a long time. And as I said, I see the GSI as part of a series of initiatives, which included the Global Development Initiative, which was introduced in September 2021, before the Ukraine crisis. I think that, you know, we all know Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide brightness. And we all know that Xi Jinping has been moving away from that, and indeed, you know, has caused anxiety amongst Western powers as to, you know, what China is intending to do. So I do think that these ideas are just not being plucked out on the spur of the moment in order to respond to a particular crisis, that they have been cogitated on for some time, as I suggested. But obviously, you know, there wasn't a question of timing. It came out just before the 12-point plan, which was announced actually on the first anniversary of the Iraq War. Now, the other question was about China taking a solo initiative, talking a lot about multilateralism and taking a solo initiative. I mean, I don't think that China is, I mean, one of the things that people say about the 12-point plan is that, you know, it is just a regurgitation of previous formulas, and that it's not offering anything concrete. Quite frankly, I don't think that China is an imperialist power. It would be an imperialist imposition to say to Ukraine, you do this, and to Russia, you do that. So rather, they'd set out general principles in order to bring conflicting parties to the same table. It's very interesting that a number of other initiatives, not so detailed as China's, are being put forward. For example, President Lula has put forward a plan for a peace club, which could involve not only Brazil, but also India, China, Indonesia. We also have 5 African nations, which are setting off, representatives from those nations setting off to Kiev and also to Moscow. And I do wonder whether there would be some way of pulling all of these initiatives together. I think that on the question of, sorry, I haven't got the Q&A in front of me. I think that on the question of how to avoid escalation, how should the West respond? I think that the West should simply respond to and adopt the approach of common security, which involves taking into account the legitimate concerns of everybody involved. As I said, that this was the idea that the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe came up with in 1975 and pursued, which was a common approach between Europe and the Soviet Union at the time. So I think that we need to go back to those kinds of ideas that were developed in response to the Cold War at the time and the nuclear arms race. Now, I don't know whether Tom has anything more that he wants to say about that. On the questions, some of the questions that John raised, I don't think that it's quite right to say that China opposed the TPNW. In fact, if you look at the working papers that they introduced at the last NPT review conference, they actually said something along the lines that they actually sympathized with the sentiments or the ideas of the TPNW, but that they didn't think that they would be able to produce the result. In terms of the UN Security Council reform, China has long advocated that Africa be included in the Security Council. I think there's more of a question of whether the Security Council, or how much longer the Security Council can justify 2 representatives from Europe and none from the rest of the global South. And again, similarly on AUKUS, what should we do about AUKUS? I mean, you know, we have to recognise that Britain's involvement in AUKUS is part of an external imposition on the region, which most of the countries in the region, or many of the countries in the region, are not happy about. Malaysia and Indonesia, you know, have both complained about it. You know, we sent an aircraft carrier off into the South China Sea a couple of years ago. We're now proposing to set up a permanent base for a nuclear submarine in Australia. We're just simply going in the wrong direction. And China's approach, as I've talked about before, is to try to get regions to organize themselves and to strengthen their own responses to their own specific problems of security. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks very much for those comments, Jenny. We're almost we're really out of time, but with the agreement of the panelists, there are 3 other questions I'd just like to give people a chance to briefly respond to those. I'd just like to say myself about the question about China and solo initiatives and multilateral initiatives. I think China is actually very enthusiastic and very proactive on multilateral initiatives, starting quite some years ago by initiating the 6-party talks on the Korean nuclear question. And if we also look at China as a driving force behind the development of, for example, BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the role of new countries wishing to join those, and they becoming more involved in international diplomacy. And just, for example, very recently, as part of his South Asia tour, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Qin Gang had a trilateral meeting in Pakistan with the Pakistan Foreign Minister and the Foreign Minister of the Afghan interim government. And that was just a couple of months after Qin Gang was in Samarkand in Uzbekistan for a meeting of Afghanistan's neighbours, which also involved both bilateral and roundtable meetings with the Afghan interim minister. So I think it's quite clear that China is very open to and indeed proactive and encouraging of multilateral initiatives. Anyway, let me just briefly read the last three questions and hopefully, and if we can have any brief responses. The first is, how can the UK cooperate with China and stabilize the Indo-Pacific region and reduce the likelihood of a China-Taiwan crisis similar to that of Russia-Ukraine? The next one says, this was briefly alluded to by Jenny Clegg. What role does international law play in China's vision of collective security? And finally, somebody writes, I'm as keen for nuclear disarmament as anyone, but to suggest this for China when she's surrounded by US military bases and continued US provocations via Taiwan seems premature, ? Big questions, short answers, please.
Oh, just reply on the last one, John Gittings, if I may. I'm not suggesting China disarms unilaterally. That clearly is not going to happen. I'm suggesting that China should say, we think there are too many nuclear weapons in the world, and we want to play our part to reduce them. And in the spirit of the agreement of the non-proliferation agreement of 1970, when the 5 existing nuclear weapons did agree to commit themselves to a course towards eventual nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Zeno, I think you were indicating you wanted to speak, please.
Thank you, Keith. I mean, these are all very interesting questions. Just especially the last one. Just briefly on the first one you just asked. First one of the last 3 different points. So first of all, I mean, comparing the China-Taiwan issue and the Russia-Ukraine issue, personally, I disagree. I mean, from a sort of international relations perspective, yeah, you can see the similarities, but then I think too many times in the West we put different things in the same basket, and I think China and Russia are different in many ways. So I kind of disagree there with this parallel. On the instability of the Indo-Pacific, I don't think is an unstable region. I think the South China Sea is quite critical. I'm a bit skeptic about narratives about, saying that Taiwan will be attacked, something will happen very soon. The South China Sea is quite problematic, especially China's claim on the one hand, and on the other hand, this new sphere of influence that the US is building or updating. I think the problem is that there's a security dilemma there that nobody wants to recognize or seem to recognize. So I think we should start by having the US and China at least acknowledging that each other moves are creating concerns on the other side. And I guess that's where the conversation should begin. But we're not there yet at all. On the contrary.
Can I make a couple of comments, Keith? That's Tom.
Yeah, hi, Tom. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I mean, thanks for the question about nuclear disarmament with respect to China. And I think it is a problematic position, but I think the root of it rests in the GSI being more widely understood and indeed adopted. But also there are important differences, I think, to appreciate between how nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon possession is conceived of in different parts of the world. And I say this as somebody who's first and foremost a nuclear abolitionist, but in China's discourse and description of its nuclear weapons possession, it's always very clearly framed within the concept of defense. And through the documentation that I've seen and the various communiques and statements that have emerged since 1964, it's been clear to me that, you know, the way in which China has explained its nuclear weapons possession and the way in which it's been factored into its general foreign relations has been very clearly one of defense, as opposed to how we in the West and how Western governments in particular frame their understanding of security. Because what the British government, what NATO, what the United States, for instance, means by security is hegemonism. You know, it's their ability to continue to defend their particular power interests and to extend that influence across the world and to maintain that influence at whatever cost, financial, moral, or human. So, you know, there are particular issues in, especially with regard to how globally NATO, the United States, and others are positioning themselves in Southeast Asia, that makes the question of any future or imminent prospect of nuclear disarmament in China one that's really for the birds. But I want to go back to Ukraine, and not the situation in Ukraine in particular, but some of the things that have developed from that and related to how the sort of approach outlined in the GSI could help us think through what is happening far more clearly and to help us therefore find some potential remedies to it. So quite apart from the horrible events in Ukraine itself, one of the most drastically worrying things that has emerged seemingly as a consequence is the prospect of the return of Russian nuclear weapons to Belarus, so whereby Belarus will host Russian nuclear weapons. Now, actually, prior to events in Ukraine, Belarus had a constitutional referendum whereby they repudiated the nuclear weapon-free zone status that was enshrined in the constitution. And all of this was put down to and explained in the narratives we had in the West as, you know, Lukashenko, the baddie, mate of Putin, also a baddie. They're trying to threaten Europe and to extend their influence in Europe more generally. But you know, if you look at the actual development of that position, it came after discussions in Germany during 2019, 2020, 2021, where large sections of the Social Democratic Party were calling for the end of the presence of US nuclear weapons in that country. The US ambassador to Poland at the time said, well, if they're removed from Germany, we'll have them in Poland. Perhaps we should have them in Poland. There have been subsequent statements by Duda in Poland saying, you know, it's not off the table. We would welcome US nuclear weapons in this country. And the whole dynamic there exposes the false idea and the very dangerous idea that in some way security is ensured by the presence of these nuclear weapons, when in fact, all it leads to is a much, much sharper posing of nuclear risks and nuclear tensions. And a common security, OSCE, GSI type approach would do away with these threats, would do away with these possibilities, and would enable a far more coherent approach to relations between states to be developed.
Thank you, Tom.
Can I have a comment?
Yes, of course, but
Okay.
I intend to offer Minister Wang the last word.
Okay.
Before I do, I just wanted to check if you have any brief comments you'd like to make, Jenny.
Actually, I just want to make one comment to highlight what I was saying about the differences between the kind of Western approach, which is procedural and emphasizing the law, which is not unimportant for China, but China also looks at process. And I think a good example of it was John talked about the need to pay more attention to votes in the General Assembly. And of course, the UN General Assembly has called again and again and again and again and again and again on Israel to find a solution to the problems of the relationship with Palestine and to condemn Israel's behavior. And this hasn't made an iota of difference, as I see it, not changed things. So how do these kinds of procedures and you know, laws actually change anything? Whereas when you look at China's what China has done in brokering the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, changing the dynamics in the region and offering to mediate on Israel-Palestine. This is kind of changing the ground in the Middle East. And so something is happening. I just want to contrast that way of the way that China goes about building relationships with states and between states as important in underlying the possibility of actually bringing some of these procedures and international laws into being.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Minister Wang, thank you so much for staying with us. And before I formally close the meeting, I'd just like to give you the last word. I gave you the first word and the last word.
Thank you very much. 3 points, and with respect to Taiwan question, as you know, Taiwan question is purely China's internal affair, and there's but one China in the world, and Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China's territory since ancient times. The One China principle is a political foundation for the establishment and development of diplomatic relations between China and other countries, and an inherent component of the post-war international order. It is also prevailing consensus of the international community and basic norm of international relations. We believe the greatest threat to peace across Taiwan Strait is Taiwan independence activities, and the foreign forces connives at and support for them. So to truly safeguard cross-strait peace, it is crucial to unequivocally oppose and stop any act of Taiwan independence. China will continue to defend our sovereignty and territorial integrity, and such mind and such determination should not be underestimated. Secondly, with about AUKUS, we strongly oppose that. It severely threatens stability and prosperity in Asia Pacific. It also greatly undermines nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it's full of Cold War mentality. So we strongly oppose the AUKUS. So we always urge US and related countries to stop pursue bloc politics and confrontation, stop put their selfish geopolitical agenda above nuclear non-proliferation regime, and stop threatening stability and prosperity in Asia Pacific area. Last point is that we will say both Belt and Road Initiative and Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative are open to the world, open to all countries. Any country, any people that love peace, would like to pursue common prosperity can join these initiatives. And I just said over 3/4 of countries around the world have joined the BRI initiative. So we will continue to work with all countries to promote peace, stability around the world. For UK, China-UK, as 2 permanent members of UN Security Council and major economies, China-UK bear important responsibilities for world peace and development. So we must stay in the course of dialogue and cooperation to create more benefits for our 2 peoples and inject more positive energy into world peace and stability. Let's work together to this end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Wang, and I hope everyone would agree with you on the need for us all to work together towards in the interests of peace and security and stability and prosperity in the world. Thank you for making those three very important points of principle in your final words. Thank you for your contributions to the meeting. Thanks also to your colleagues in the embassy who assisted us in the preparation, and it's always a pleasure to work with the Chinese embassy. It's always a great pleasure. Thank you to all the other speakers for putting forward their views, raising the questions. Thank you to everyone who's attended and stayed with what's actually been quite a long meeting. And thank you particularly to the people who raised questions. For people attending tonight, if you're not a member of SACU, or if you used to be a member, please consider joining or rejoining. You can find details on the website. Membership of SACU represents excellent value, not least as membership includes a subscription to the first-class magazine, China Eye. Thank you all. I hope, and I'm sure SACU will continue organizing more such interesting meetings, and look forward to seeing you next time. And of course, if you want to go over the points, it'll be up on YouTube and so on. But thank you, everyone, sticking for quite a long meeting. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and best of luck in everyone's work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.